Hey, how's it going, Dr. Spin? So this week, I'm going to be looking at an album I discovered a couple of years ago by an artist I really have come to respect a whole lot since I've discovered her, just not too much prior to that. This album is called The Kid by Kaitlyn Aurelia Smith. Kaitlyn Aurelia Smith is a synth artist. She's a synthesist. And she has an interesting background that I think is kind of worth mentioning. She was raised in northwestern U.S. in kind of a verdant part of Washington State. The Orcas Island, I believe, is what it was called. And she describes it as a very kind of lush area with lots of environment. It was very kind of picturesque. And she went on to go study music at Berkeley and study composition and sound design. And was looking for a vehicle for herself to perform in. She kind of thought at first that she would want to be a vocalist primarily. And then she thought about doing classical guitar as her primary thing and then classical piano. But then her neighbor, oddly, introduced her to a Buchla 100 synthesizer. Her adoption of this instrument as her sort of primary voice for her composition was a big selling point for me. If you know anything about me, I'm kind of into weird instruments, and especially instruments with interesting different interfaces and how that interface affects the way that music is made. You can tell if a person writes a song on a guitar or a piano. It's very unlikely that Pete Townsend wrote Baba O'Reilly on a piano. It's very guitar based, and likewise, Elton John songs don't really work very well on guitar. They're the product of his interaction with the piano. So I was very interested in seeing what would happen, what happens when a person adopts kind of a unique instrument. The Buchla synthesizers have been around since the mid-'60s. They were kind of contemporaneous with Bob Moog's, although they didn't quite get the visibility, and there's a reason for that, actually, I think. In the early days of synthesizers, there was quite a bit of controversy as to how the interface was going to work. A synthesizer doesn't have to have a keyboard on it. Most of what happens with a synthesizer, especially the modular synthesizers, is, twisting knobs and finding ways to change waveforms and pitches. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to have a piano keyboard to it. Now, Bob Moog decided at a certain point that he was going to attach a piano keyboard to it. And whenever he did that, of course, he attached a whole history of music to it. And so people like Rick Wakeman and those kinds of, Keith Emerson with all sorts of classical background could attach themselves to those synthesizers and find success. So our idea and visibility. So our idea of synthesizers are sort of attached to that, but really synthesizers don't have to have a keyboard. And the Buchla instruments, Don Buchla, the person who made the Buchla synthesizers, really tried to shy away from making such an obvious interface with the music. And you still see that with the Buchla instruments. The one that's sort of Kaitlyn Aurelia Smith's instrument of choice is an instrument called the Buchla Music Easel. And if you look at the instrument, it's got, the top part is a bunch of patches, and it's very reminiscent of, it is a modular synthesizer. Lots of knobs and it works a lot with sequencing and oscillators and that sort of thing. And there is a piano keyboard attached to it, but if you look at it, it's very flat. It's not really intended for virtuosic piano playing. It's more meant to be as a controller. So if you watch Kaitlyn Aurelia Smith playing the Buchla synthesizer, you'll notice that she's playing notes on there, but it's not just like it's playing a wavetone. She's using it as a pitch center, a controller for all of the waveforms and all of the oscillations that are coming out of the top part of the instrument. Now, Bob Moog's instruments did that as well, but more people attach themselves to the instrument as a keyboard player than as just a synthesist. So when Kaitlyn Aurelia Smith kind of got hip to Buchla instruments and she became sort of fascinated with them, she sort of locked herself in a small room with them for, a year, I think is what rumor has it, and started just experimenting, going out and figuring out what the thing could do and how she could get ideas out of it. The album that I discovered Kaitlyn Aurelia Smith through was the album Ears. And Ears was like an absolute favorite album of mine in 2016. I discovered it, had never heard anything like it. And I listened to it over and over and over again whenever I was, living in Austin, and really impressed me and made me think a lot about how her music was shaped by this Buchla. Both on Ears and on The Kid, the Buchla is not the only instrument that she has there. Especially on The Kid, there's a list of other instruments that are on there. Like, she's got some Moog instruments on there. She's got a Fairlight. Classical analog synths make up her background, and some orchestral instruments too. On The Kid, she has a small ensemble of like bassoon, cello, trumpet, clarinet, and flute. She did all the arrangements for them and had this Stargaze quintet come in, a group called Stargaze came in and did those arrangements, the performances on the album. So the album is very, very rich in its textures. And these sort of synthetic sounds marry very well and cross over with those more traditional, wind instruments, orchestral instruments. And when you're talking about Kaitlyn Aurelia Smith's music, especially on The Kid, I think that considering where she came from, what her upbringing is like, is important to consider, because the sounds that she gets on the album are definitely organic. They're not organic in their production, but in what they're paying tribute to. The way the Buchla is controlled, there's lots of rippling arpeggios, synthesizer sounds, and oscillators that are making these, very classic synthesizer sounds. But because of the way the Buchla is you interact with the Buchla, they're very rippling and very sequence based. But alongside those sounds, she's got lots of sounds that are definitely evocative of nature, clearly evocative of nature. Like water splashing sounds and birds and crickets, and although they're not actually those sounds, they're definitely meant to refer to those sounds. And I think that she's pretty open about this in interviews, that she was influenced by the environment in which she was brought up in. So even though she's playing this sort of high tech instrument, her inspiration also comes from sort of nature and the natural environment. And the textures on The Kid are impossibly complex. I mean, they overlap and they interact with each other in ways that sometimes don't even kind of make sense rhythmically. They're almost like they're disparate and fighting with each other sometimes. But the overall effect of the album is this sort of wash of interacting events, both natural and synthetic, to make up the album's overall texture. And in addition to this really dense environmental landscape that she's creating, she's using more of her voice on this album than she had on the previous album. Plus, she's using quite a bit of vocal modulation. There's not many passages on the album where she doesn't have like a pitch-shifted doubled voice of herself, like maybe down an octave. Or there's some really great moments on the album where to kind of open up a new emotive aspect of her melody, this sort of, she'll hit a harder note and this gate will open up and it'll add kind of a new timbral color to her voice as she's performing. Very effective use of sort of augmenting her voice through technology. Coming off of Ears, The Kid is a much more accessible piece of work. There's no song on the album that's over 6 minutes long. I think most of them hover around 4 minutes long. At the same time, I wouldn't say that Kaitlyn Aurelia Smith is, going to make any hit singles on this album. What she does is still, at the very least, kind of abstract, if not avant-garde at times. But there is a sense of a cognitive narrative that she's trying to get out on this album that I don't think on Ears she was really trying to do the same way. And I don't necessarily think that she's trying to make a pop album here, but I do think that she's trying to make an album that's accessible to people who have the kind of attention span that people have these days with, the 2 to 4 minute song, but also make a larger work. The album itself is kind of a concept album. It sort of outlines a person's journey from birth until death, and the kid is the character kind of who goes through this journey. And again, although she's framing this album, the kid, in the terms of a narrative, it's still very, generally speaking, very abstract. The lyrics to all the songs are very impressionistic. It's not like you can hear her, it's not like Tommy, where you have a plot and it goes through the whole thing. As a matter of fact, most of the storyline that you can glean from the album is really encapsulated in the titles of the songs more than anything else. And I also think this may be an example of an album that might work better on vinyl, because my understanding is, of course, I have the CD copy, but my understanding is that if you have a vinyl copy of this, it's a 2-record set, and each a side of the record represents a different phase in this the kid's journey, which is not quite as clear on the CD, because on the CD they're all just tracked together as one big long thing. So the seams between these various 4 parts is a little bit less obvious. But I can say over the course of the album that there is sort of a sense of evolution. In the beginning of the album, things were very a chaotic, agitated feel, and as the kid goes through his or her life journey, then, by the end, things are much more smoothed out. The orchestral aspects of the album take a bigger role, and it seems much more concordant. This progression that she's outlining musically is completely part of the narrative. If you go through the song titles, you can see definitely like it goes from an intention, and she's painting this impressionistic picture about what the intention is. And it's interesting because there are still some tracks on here that are instrumental tracks. And very often, those instrumental tracks have the most evocative titles. Who I am and why I am where I am. I mean, that's a heavy question. And that particular track is probably the most just environmental piece of the whole album. You'll listen to this album all the way through, and as much as it is one of Kaitlyn Aurelia Smith's most accessible albums, there's not a whole lot of hooks on the album. You'll listen to the entire thing and kind of have some moments that you think back to, but generally speaking, there's not a whole lot that will, stick with you from after you're done with it. It's experienced all the way through, and I think that's kind of part of why the album is so effective, because it's an album that as you go through it, you find each song is distinct from one another. You can definitely tell where one song starts and the other one stops, and you can definitely tell the stylistic shifts that happen throughout the album. But overall, your experience of the album is almost kind of meditative. There's this sense that it's introspective and thoughtful and meant for you to listen to and sort of absorb as a introspective experience, and not necessarily something that you'll walk down the boardwalk singing to yourself for grins. It's a contemplative piece of work, and one that's, even though the concepts as they're presented are very abstract, the abstractness of these concepts are what sort of draws you in and allows you to think about answering these questions, And clearly, Kaitlyn Aurelia Smith, in the process of making the kid is asking questions about herself and her nature and where she's from and what she's going through and where she's headed in life. And it's very kind, ultimately, of her to allow us to come with her on this journey, because these are global questions that human beings have on a day-to-day basis. And so this album gives you a little bit of space perhaps to contemplate some of those bigger questions about, what's this all about? Musically, it's a very deep album. Conceptually, it's a very deep album, although not explicit in its depth. If it's there if you dig for it, which is, again, one of the things that will keep you coming back to the album more than likely. I coming back to review this album, I hadn't listened to it in a while, and really feel like I'm just kind of scratching the surface on everything that's going on in the album. There's a whole lot going on. It's impossibly complex, but at the same time, very soothing and easy to listen to, and fascinating to examine. So an album worth checking out for sure, as is anything that I've heard from Kaitlyn Aurelia Smith. So I would highly suggest The Kid if you haven't checked that album out. Okay. And that's all I got for you guys this week. I appreciate your time. If you like the video, of course, like it, subscribe it, share it out, make some recommendations, give me a thumbs up. And until next time, I will catch you guys on the flip side. Oh, by the way, happy anniversary to In the Court of the Crimson King and Hot Rats. I think they both released today, 50 years ago. Crazy thought. Anyway, I'll talk to you guys later. Thanks.
Everything I touch, it wants to be smooth and get it right. Just like you.